We've been on this series talking about a biblical perspective about justice. Now, of course, this series is kind of in response and speaking about a lot of things that have been going on and occurring in our society today. We see it all over the news all the time. A lot of unrest, a lot of cries for justice. So we started a couple weeks ago. We talked about, what is justice, taking a biblical look and definition of that word and what justice meant. We talked about such things as there has to be a standard for human behavior. And in addition to a standard, there has to be something in place, some kind of system to make sure that the standard is promoted so that it's known, but also that it's enforced, that it's followed, and also that it applies to everyone equally and fairly. And so we talked about how God is a God of justice, and then last week we talked about justice with God. And in particular, we really wanted to look at the fact that all of us as human beings are guilty in the sight of God, and that the ultimate justice with God, or being made right with God, came at the cross of Jesus Christ, which was the single greatest act of injustice this earth has ever witnessed. Today, I want to turn the discussion on the phrase that we've all heard, and probably heard a lot here recently. I want to talk about God's word on social justice. Now, what do I mean by social justice? Now, look, there are a lot of different ways to define that phrase, and I can't touch on all of them. So for the purpose of this message today, here's what I'm talking about primarily when I use this phrase, social justice. All throughout human history, America today, or you read history books, nations throughout all of human history, there's always been this struggle. The struggle between really two classes or groups of people. You can simply call them the haves and the have-nots, okay? The haves represent the most powerful people in a society, the people with governing authority, the people with wealth and privilege and resources, the people with influence, the people that could be political leaders, it could be military leaders, it could be business leaders, the people who have the wealth and the resources and the power and the governing authority within a society. So they're the haves. The have-nots are the people who don't got that. All that stuff I just said, the have-nots don't have it. They don't have the power, they don't have the wealth, they don't have the influence, they don't have a lot of the things that the haves have. So that has always created tension within any society, within human history. And in particular, when I talk about social justice, what I mean is, how do the haves treat the have-nots? How do the people who have the power and the resources and the wealth and the influence, how do they treat the have-nots? And what we're going to see today in the Bible is God is very, very concerned with these questions. So, for instance, a couple of questions for the haves in a society. Do they create a system that benefits everyone equally and fairly, or do they rig the system so it only works for them? It's a valid question. Already getting deep, huh, Ruth? I know it's dropping a bomb here. Another question is, do the haves maintain their status and their wealth and their authority and their power through the exploitation and the oppression of those who don't have it? These are very important questions. And again, what I want to show you from the scriptures today, I want it to be absolutely clear to all of us that, number one, God is very concerned with how that plays out in society. How do the most powerful treat the most vulnerable in a society? Not only that, we're going to see God's heart for those who are at the bottom rung, for those who are the weakest and the most vulnerable and the oppressed of a society. God's heart is for them, and we need to see that today. So what I want to start with is I want to read a couple of scriptures. I want to highlight God's heart and care and concern for the weakest and the poorest in a society. Let me just say, I've got a lot of scriptures today, a lot. So there was no way to really do this message. It's like editing a movie. I had to leave a lot of good scenes on the chopping floor. I mean, there's so many verses, so get ready for a lot of Bible verses today. This first one I want to read is from Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 18, because it's important that in the very beginning, in the Old Testament, when God separated a people unto himself to be his own special nation, the nation of Israel, and he gave them laws and he gave them rules to live by, he gave them a standard, and then he gave them consequences if they failed to live up to that standard. Well, listen to the standard that God gives them as it concerns treating the poor. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He is the great God, the mighty and awesome God, who shows no partiality and cannot be bribed. He ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. He shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing. All throughout the Old Testament. And again, I'm going to give you a lot of scriptures today, and believe you me, there are a lot more that I could have used, but I had to limit it for time's sake. Within the Old Testament nation of Israel and that society at that time, the have-nots or the weakest members of that society are represented by 3 or 4 different groups of people. Orphans, or those with no parents, specifically no father. It's a father-dominated society. So orphans or the fatherless, widows, so women who've lost their husbands, foreigners, we would call them immigrants today, people who are not native Israelites living in the land, so immigrants or foreigners, and of course the poor, which those 3 groups of people primarily tended to be the poor in the nation of Israel because unlike our society today, that society, that civilization, especially their economic system, it was an agricultural or land-based system. So basically, if you had a farm, if you owned land, that gave you power, that gave you wealth, that gave you influence. And if you didn't have land, which typically the widows and the orphans and the immigrants didn't own land, they were kind of cut out of the system or the wealth of that day and that era. So you see, God is very concerned. Right from the get-go, he says, hey, look, I don't take bribes. I treat everybody equally. I give the standard, and I apply that standard to everybody, rich, poor, everybody equally. The standard should be applied to. The next verse I want to read is Psalm 146, 7 through 9. Again, I'm trying to show you God's heart for the weakest members of a society. It says, he gives justice to the oppressed and food to the hungry. The Lord frees the prisoners. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are weighed down. The Lord loves the godly. The Lord protects the foreigners among us. He cares for the orphans and widows, but he frustrates the plans of the wicked. Not only does God care about the people who are in the lowest rungs of society, the people who have the least amount of influence and resources and abilities, but God identifies himself with them. And what I mean by that, my wife, she gave me a book to read to kind of help get ready for this message. And it's a book about, biblical views on justice and stuff. And the author said something, I've never heard anybody say this before, but he said, God identifies himself with the poor and with the weak and with the oppressed. And I want to read this verse. He put it like this. Psalm 68:5 is the next verse I got. But he says like this, think about how you like to be introduced. And he went on to say how, like, if he's a pastor, so when he would go preach somewhere, they would ask him, well, how do you want to be introduced when we welcome you up on stage? And he'd say, okay, you can just say this. If I send an email, I may say Nick Height, lead pastor of the Bridge, or when I open the service, hey, I'm Nick Height, lead pastor of the Bridge. So that's how I introduce myself. So that's what I want you to know about me, right? Well, this is how God introduces himself. Father to the fatherless, defender of widows, this is God whose dwelling is holy. So God would walk on stage and say, here's what I want you to know me as. Here's something I want you to know that's very important about who I am as a being. This is God. I am the father to the fatherless. I am the defender of the widow. In other words, I am the one who will fight for the rights of those who cannot fight for themselves. I am a voice to the voiceless. Will represent those who don't have the ability to speak up or represent themselves. I will defend and fight for the weakest, the most exploited, the most oppressed within any civilization or society. That is very important to know about God. And I'll be honest with you, I don't normally think of God that way. Oh, God's holy, God's the creator, he's my savior. But do we really think and consider God is the father to the fatherless, defender of the widow, love and care and concern for the foreigner and the immigrant? He's concerned about those who are so often shut out of a society and don't have access to the best of what a nation has to offer. So that's very important, again, that's who God is. That's how he identifies himself. He has a heart and a care and concern for the weakest among us. Now, when it comes to, that was kind of the standard that God laid out in the very beginning when he gave the law of Moses to his people. Okay, I want you guys to follow me. I want you to don't worship idols. I'm the only God you're going to have. And don't mistreat the poor. Don't oppress them. Give them justice. Now, do you think Israel followed that? No. Yeah. If you read throughout the Old Testament, they didn't live up to. They didn't live up to most of the law. Now, I will say this, probably the number one sin as you read through the Old Testament dealing with the nation of Israel, the number one sin that God would always call them out on was idolatry, which is the worship of foreign gods. They would worship the gods of the foreign nations. They would make idols out of gold and wood. They'd make golden calves and pray to them. They would forsake God and worship foreign gods. But probably a close second to idolatry is God would call them out on these issues of social justice. God would call them out for how the haves treated the have-nots. So one of the greatest sources to understand the heart of God as it concerns social justice is to go back and read through the prophets. Now, if you don't know kind of how the Old Testament is laid out, you got the first 5 books of the Bible. It's sometimes called the 5 books of Moses or the Torah, the Pentateuch, you'll hear it called. So that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Talks about creation and all that, the formation of Israel, the giving of the law. And then another major component of the Old Testament is called the prophets. Now, the prophets were basically messengers from God. They were people who got a word, a message from God to give to the people. Sometimes Israel, sometimes foreign nations, sometimes specific people, individuals, but they would get a message from God. So God would speak through the prophets. So what I want to show you, and again, I got a lot of scriptures, is I want to show you a lot of the prophetic scriptures where God calls out his people on these issues of social justice. And it begins with God. It always begins with the leadership. Now, if you don't know a godly principle, but basically Jesus said this, to whom more is given, more is required. There's a higher accountability on leaders than there is everyone else. Because if a leader is corrupt, then guess what happens with the people? You know, if leaders are good, moral, godly people, then things tend to flow well under them. So God will begin always by calling out the leaders in a nation and a society. So I want to read you some verses that show God calling out the leaders of his nation, Israel, concerning their social justice or lack thereof. First verse I want to read is from Micah 3, 9 through 11. Now remember, this is God speaking. These are the direct words of God. Yes, they were written by Micah the prophet, but this is the word of God. Listen to me, you leaders of Israel. You hate justice and twist all that is right. You're building Jerusalem on a foundation of murder and corruption. My God, could we put Washington, D.C. in for Jerusalem there? Now, if just a kind of rabbit trail here, in the very first message, I read you the verse, I think it was Psalm 89, where it says, the foundation of the Lord's throne is justice and righteousness, not murder and corruption. And Jerusalem should have been the same way. Verse 11 says, you rulers make decisions based on bribes. Woo. You priests teach God's law only for a price. You ever hear anybody say, well, I'm not going to church, pastor only cares about money? It happens. I don't believe I'm one of those. God knows, God will judge me. But it does happen. There are pastors and spiritual leaders who are only in it for what they can get out of it. They exploit their congregation for financial gain. They cheat people. And God calls them out too. He says, you prophets won't prophesy unless you're paid. Yet all of you claim to depend on the Lord. No harm can come to us, you say, for the Lord is here among us. So God's not happy with the leadership. They corrupt justice. They twist what is right. They take bribes. They only lead for financial gain. Micah 7:3 says this. Both their hands are equally skilled at doing evil. Officials and judges alike demand bribes. The people with influence get what they want, and together they scheme to twist justice. I couldn't help but think of, lobbyists. People who've got all the money. Yeah, you can call your congressman and say, hey, I'm concerned about that, and they'll probably listen to you because you're going to vote for them or not vote for them. But then there's all the lobbyists lining all their pockets with money on both sides to get what they want, to get the influence they want in the society so that the system works for them. And that's what we're talking about here. Look at Isaiah 3:14. Remember, we're talking about the leaders. God is calling out the leaders, the political leaders, the military leaders, the business leaders, the spiritual leaders. The Lord comes forward to pronounce judgment on the elders and rulers of his people. You've ruined Israel, my vineyard. Your houses are filled with things stolen from the poor. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about how they steal from the poor. It doesn't mean they, mugged them in the alley and took their wallet. That's not what he's talking about, and we'll see that a little bit later. So God calls out the leadership of the nation. They take bribes and payoffs. So basically, justice comes to the highest bidder. You want a verdict or a decision in your case to go your way? Let's see who can pay the most. Now, obviously, you want laws and you want the system to work for you. The people in power are taking bribes and money to those who have that wealth and that influence. So who does that benefit? Does it benefit those who have wealth? Yes, right? It makes the system work for them. Does it benefit those who don't have wealth, the poor, the needy, the downtrodden? No. And not only that, do they make a system and laws that don't work for the poor and the needy. They exploit the weakest and the poorest members of society to benefit financially and with power. Now look, how were the poor exploited? And what does God specifically call them out for? And this is the next thing I want to look at. Again, I got about 3 or 4 scriptures for that. Listen to this, Micah 6:10-12. And as I'm reading this, I know, and I kind of make some analogies to modern society. But as you listen to this and I read this, I'm sure you guys can think like, gee, this still happens today, right? None of this has changed. People are still people. Human condition, human nature has not changed in a few thousand years. Micah 6:10-12, God says this. What shall I say about the homes of the wicked filled with treasures gained by cheating? What about the disgusting practice of measuring out grain with dishonest measures? How can I tolerate your merchants who use dishonest scales and weights? The rich among you have become wealthy through extortion and violence. Your citizens are so used to lying, their tongues can no longer tell the truth. Unfair, unethical business practices. I was just telling somebody the other day, I think of these verses a lot when I go and pump my gas. Next time you go pump your gas, if you've never paid attention to this, look somewhere on the pump. You'll see a little sticker, probably about yay big, little square sticker. And you should see a little stamp on it. It's basically from where somebody from the state came and calibrated that gas pump to make sure that when you pump a gallon of gas, you're not getting a half a gallon of gas. Because God forbid somebody would rig the gas pump so, they can make more money off you. That never happens, right? Nobody tries to cheat anybody in business. Anybody remember Enron? Come on. Unfair, unethical business practices. That's what he's talking about, the unjust scales, the unjust weight. So you come and buy some grain from me, and we put on the scale that says, well, here's a pound of grain, but in reality, it's only a half a pound. So I'm making extra money off of you. I'm exploiting you. So God calls the nation out for their unfair business practices that primarily exploit the poor and the most vulnerable in society. Listen to this one, Amos 8:4-6. Listen to this. You who rob the poor and trample down the needy. You can't wait for the Sabbath day to be over and the religious festivals to end so you can go back to cheating the helpless. Now look, before I go any further, these are supposedly God's people. These are the Israelites. So God is calling them out for their religious hypocrisy. You're still coming to offer your sacrifices. You're still following the law of Moses and doing all the festivals and all that jazz to outwardly look righteous and holy, but then you go and treat people like crap. And God is not happy with that. There are some verses in here that I didn't leave out where God's like, I hate your offerings. I hate your festivals and your feasts because you come and act holy and righteous, and then you go out and treat each other like crap. God will call out hypocrisy. He can't stand it. He says, listen, how are they robbing? He says, here's this dishonest measurement again. You measure out grain with dishonest measures. You cheat the buyer with dishonest scales. Look at this one. You mix the grain you sell with chaff swept from the floor. Go back to the gas. You think there's any gas stations that mix their gas with something else so you're not getting the gas you should get so they can spread their profits a little bit more? Come on. It's like when you go to Taco Bell and you get a watered-down Mountain Dew. I'm like, oh, no, you're taking this back. Anyway, that's just me. Then you listen to this, you enslave poor people for one piece of silver or a pair of sandals. So again, you have the unethical business practices. Now that last line, it says where you enslave poor people for one piece of silver or a pair of sandals. Now what does that mean in that society? What was that talking about? Because this is something you will see over and over again throughout the Old Testament where God is calling out. Now, just like today, back then, people would get into financial trouble, right? We've all been there. So sometimes when you get in a little bit of trouble financially, you got to go for a loan. Anybody, come on, we've probably all done that. You go get a loan, either you're borrowing money from a friend, you go to the bank to try to get a loan, something to try to tide you over to get you through whatever you're going through. Same thing back then. People would borrow money if they were in trouble. But when you read the law of Moses, God was very concerned about when somebody would fall into financial ruin or hard times and they would go to a fellow Israel for a loan, God was very clear in the law of Moses, do not charge them any interest. In other words, don't try to gain financially by someone else's troubles and problems. Not only were not allowed by the law of Moses to charge interest, but the rule of law was if somebody comes to you and borrows and takes a loan out, now just like today, they would have to offer up something for collateral, right? You go down to the bank and ask, hey, can I have $10,000? Great, you're going to pay it back, but we need some collateral. What do you got that if you don't pay your loan, we're going to take from you, your house or something? You know what I mean? They got to have some kind of collateral. No different then. So people would offer up something as collateral. Now, one of the expressions you'll see throughout the Old Testament is kind of representing the poorest of the poor. So in other words, if a person didn't have land, if they didn't have any possessions they could put up for collateral, probably the least thing they would have was what they call an outer garment, the shirt off their back. You ever heard that expression? Yeah. So they would have an outer garment, which wasn't just outerwear to have a nice coat. Usually for the poorest of poor, their outer garment served not only to, against rain or elements, but it served as their blanket when they would sleep at night. And so the law stated that if somebody gave you their outer garment, literally the shirt off their back as kind of the collateral security for their loan that they would repay it, the law was you have to give that back by the end of the day. Because if they're sleeping with it and you don't give it back, what are they going to sleep in? They're going to freeze or they're going to starve or whatever. You can't exploit the poor. Not only that, but here's what they would do to exploit the poor. So they would loan them money, and they would usually charge interest, or they'd add some outrageous fine, or they'd make up some stupid law so that they could take everything from them. And they would take their lands. And in that system, you could also be sold as a servant. So in other words, I'm going to put you to work in my field to pay off the loan. And then they wouldn't pay them their wages. So basically, you end up with slavery. You end up with free labor. So in a farm agricultural-based economy, man, if you got somebody to work your fields for and you ain't got to pay for them, woo, boy, that's profits, right? You don't got to pay labor? Come on. We saw that in the South, in the United States. Come on. We saw that with slavery, and they didn't have to pay labor. So God was not happy with that. He was not happy when they would sell people and rob from the poor. Amos 5:11 says this. And I know, again, I got a lot of verses here. God says this, you trample the poor, stealing their grain through taxes and unfair rent. Now look, it's not saying taxes are bad. We're talking unfair taxes or going above and beyond and charging them beyond fair. Unfair rent. You think anybody in Flint's paying unfair rent today? Come on. People who come in who don't even live here. I see this. I live in Flint, okay? I live in the Mott Park neighborhood. I see this battle play out in our neighborhood all the time. Somebody living in California buys up some cheap house in Flint online, doesn't even fix it up, probably don't even have running water, and then charge some crazy, outrageous rent from people who don't have much more options. What are they going to do? Live on the streets? They got to live somewhere. They don't care to fix the house up. They don't care what happens there. See it all the time. Stealing from the poor through taxes and unfair rent. Therefore, though you build beautiful stone houses, you'll never live in them. Though you plant lush vineyards, you'll never drink wine from them. So God's saying, look, you think you're going to benefit by exploiting the poor? Think again. Remember, he is the defender of the weak and of the poor. And then finally, Malachi 3:5. This is my last verse, believe it or not. At that time, I will put you on trial. I'm eager to witness against all sorcerers and adulterers and liars. I will speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, who deprive the foreigners living among you of justice, for these people do not fear me, says the Lord of heaven armies. So just kind of summarize. I know that was a lot. They exploited the poor through unfair rent, unfair taxes or fees or penalties. They exploited the poor by not giving them justice. So if a poor person came to present their case and they felt like they were being wrong, if they couldn't pay to bribe the judge, guess what? No justice for them. Case goes against them every time. Through dishonest business practices, through denial of wages or unfair wages and compensation, by taking all they had for failure to repay loans, which was usually through some kind of fraud. They wouldn't even give them the chance to repay it. So whether it's corrupt leadership or the exploitation of the weak or the have-nots, and you guys know the answer to this because I've kind of alluded to it, do these things still happen today? Yeah, all over the world. Do they happen in the United States of America? Yes, they do. And I know that we're not the nation of Israel, and I don't have time to get into that. But it doesn't change God's heart. Yes, he expected more from Israel. They were his covenant people. Do these things happen in the church? Yeah. I've told you, there are spiritual leaders out there who are in it only for the money, who prey on people's weaknesses to exploit their congregation financially. I'm telling you, that isn't me. Okay? Now, if you don't know me well enough, you could say, well, fine. God knows me. Those that are close know. God knows I have not taken anything unfairly or unjustly from this church or any of you. I'm not living in a mansion in Beverly Hills. I'm not exploiting this church. But again, God knows. But it happens. I can't deny that it does happen. These things still happen today in our society, unfortunately. And I'm telling you, God has not changed how he feels about it. He's not happy when the haves exploit the have-nots. He's not happy when those who have power and wealth and influence rig the system to make it work only for them and to cut out certain members of society. And I just want to give a couple of specific examples of how some of this has played out, just like in the city of Flint, not necessarily the whole country. A book that I recommend all of you read, I recommend you read a book called Demolition Means Progress. This book was written, it's basically a look at systemic injustice throughout the history of Flint, especially towards blacks and African Americans and other minorities. Basically how the system was rigged to work for people who had the power and the influence and to work against those who didn't. Some of you worked for GM many years, and my grandfather worked for GM for 32 years. I don't know how many of you know this because maybe it was a little bit before our time. But when GM first started exploding, especially after World War II, yes, black people could get jobs in the factory, but guess what? They weren't given the best jobs. You're going to be a janitor. You're going to work in the foundries. You're going to get the crappiest jobs with less pay than white people would get. That's just how it was. Now, those things have changed. Don't get me wrong. A lot of that has changed. But a book like Demolition Means Progress, you will see how, whether it was GM, whether it was the school system, yeah, we didn't have quote-unquote segregation up here, but they found other ways to segregate people. They found ways to rig the system to work for certain people and not for others. It happened. So that's one example. Here's some other examples of vulnerable people who are suffering in our society today. Human trafficking. One of the ugliest stains in our nation, human trafficking. The exploitation, especially of women and children for sexual gain. I read something the other day on Facebook. A lady was giving her testimony. See, we think of human trafficking, we think of some pimp down on the corner with his prostitutes, and, maybe we have in mind what human trafficking looks like, or selling people. Well, certainly it doesn't happen here. And this lady was talking about how she grew up. Her dad sold her out, rented her out. They would go to amusement parks, and he would put her in with another man in like a bathroom. Just looks totally legit. Guy's taking his girl to go to the bathroom. She didn't even know what was happening or that it was wrong. And he profited financially off of trafficking his own daughter. These are not isolated stories. These things happen, and they happen here in Flint. They happen right under our noses, all around us. The exploitation of women and children for sexual gain and profit and financial gain and profit. These things happen here. I don't talk about this next subject a lot. I know it's very controversial. Do you think God turns a blind eye to the millions and millions of unborn lives that are never given a chance to live? Now look, I'm not arguing for or against abortion, overturn Roe v. Wade. That's not what I'm up here for. I think, my personal opinion, sometimes a legitimate case can be made. If it's a medical issue or, sometimes I'm not that extreme to say it should never happen. But I will say this, and I don't know the stats, but I dare, if we did research, the vast majority of abortions happen because people wanted to have sex, but darn it, it created a life and we didn't want it. It's just a matter of convenience because we don't want to follow God's boundaries for sex. People want sex but don't want the consequences, and it leads to millions. How many unborn lives have been terminated? And again, this is no shame. If you've had an abortion, please, I mean no shame or disrespect, because God is merciful and just. But you talk about people who can't defend themselves, the unborn. How about the elderly? In our society today, man, I should say this to our shame. We just want to take our elderly and just shove them in some home somewhere. But in these societies, the biblical societies, the Eastern cultures even today, man, they had such high regard and honor for their elders. Their parents would stay with them. They wouldn't just ship them off to some home somewhere. They took care of their elders. And we all know today that money can buy you justice, right? If you can afford the best lawyers, you can get off any charge. Not most of us can afford, the top lawyers there are. So we know, the system works for the wealthy. We know at times that it's rigged for those who have and those who have not. And as I close and the band comes back up, what do I want you to do with this message this week? I know it's a lot. It was a heavy word. I think more than anything, I wanted us to understand, remember, all those injustices I just pointed out, whether it was happened then in Israel or today in America, it does still happen. I wanted us to see God's heart for that group of people. Remember, he said, I am the father to the fatherless. I am the defender of the widows. God fights for those who cannot fight for themselves. God has a special heart for those who are being exploited and oppressed and misused and taken advantage of and denied justice. And I don't say these things so that we either feel guilty or ashamed or angry and demand justice. I know there's a lot of responses to this, and I kind of dealt with some of that last week. I just simply wanted us to see God's heart for those who are the weakest and the most vulnerable in our society, that God does have a heart for social justice. He's very concerned with how a nation, a society, a city, a church, or a group of people treats its most vulnerable and weakest members. Next week, we're going to talk more about what should our response be to these things. What does God want us to do when it comes to how we deal with injustice in our lives personally or in our lives as a nation? But this week, all I want you to really do is maybe take some time to consider some specific examples of injustice. I mentioned the book Demolition Means Progress. There's a lot of other books, there's articles. Do some research on human trafficking. Do some research on elderly or on just some issue of injustice, how African Americans have been treated, or immigrants or foreigner, or any other minority group or groups of have-nots. How the rich maybe have exploited the poor, or examples of bribes, or see some of those things. And when you look at those things, I want you to remember and consider who God is, the heart of God, that he is so concerned with how a society, again, treats its lowest members. And I still got a lot to say in this series, but let me just say this, kind of previewing the last two messages. In the end, nobody will get away with anything. Everyone will, all of us will answer to God. No one will get away. I know it's frustrating. I know sometimes justice seems denied, and it seems like all the haves are getting away with all this. They're not. They never have. They never will. There will be the day when everyone gives account in the sight of God. And again, that's kind of getting into my next few messages, but let me just close in prayer. Father, I know this was a very difficult word, kind of a heavy word. But God, I thank you that you let us know in your word how you feel about these things, how you feel about social justice. You let us know how you feel about how a society treats its most vulnerable, at-risk members. And God, we know that many of these injustices still play out today. We know that often the system is rigged to work for those who have the power and the influence and the wealth and the means and the ability, and it works against those who don't. We know that there are weaker, more vulnerable members in our society. God, I think of the children and the women who are being human trafficked, sold for sex. God, I think of the elderly who die alone in a nursing home, no contact with their family. God, those who just can't get ahead in life because the system's rigged against them. Unfair wages, unfair housing practices and rent. There is still so much injustice within our own culture today, God, and I know we can see from your word how you feel about it. So God, I guess I would just ask, have mercy on us. God, have mercy on our nation. God, have mercy on this city. God, have mercy on us. Help us to see the injustices, call them out for what they are. Teach us how we should respond, what we should do about these things, God. Because it creates and stirs up such a mix of emotions. God, what do we do with it? What do we do with the anger? What do we do with the hurt? What do we do with all of this? Help us to see that, Father, as we go through the rest of this series. But God, I do pray that you would just have mercy. God, that you would show tremendous grace. And I know you will, because God, your heart is for those who are taken advantage of. Your heart is for the oppressed and the exploited and the downtrodden. So God, we just thank you for that. Thank you for your mercy and your grace today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys.